Happy Easter, folks. Welcome to Virtually Sunday, a presentation of Whatsoever You Do Incorporated. I'm Norbertine Father Tim Shilcox, coming to you from the Abbey in De Pere with reflections on the scriptures for the third Sunday of Easter, Cycle B. So that would be the Gospel coming from Luke chapter 24, just after the story of the Cleophas and his buddy recognizing Jesus in the breaking of the bread on the road to Emmaus. About a month ago, I had a call from our prior, Father Brad. He's also in charge of the worship liturgical committee in the Abbey. He had asked if I'd be willing to preside at the Mass of the Lord's Supper for Holy Thursday here at the Abbey. I was so grateful that he asked. I'd been hoping to be asked. I'd never been asked at the Abbey. Lots of times in the parishes, it was my privilege to do that. But he asked, and I was glad to say yes, and began to prepare a homily and to learn the ritual well enough, keep it familiar, to prepare for the mandatum, the reenactment of the ritual washing of the feet of 12 people, lay people, men and women, some Norbertine fratres. And it turned out to be a really beautiful experience. Part of it, I have to say, I was really praying hard, asking God to help me through the Mass, especially to help me through the foot washing piece, to stay focused and humble so that it might be authentic, not just an act or a put on, but an expression of Jesus' humble service. And I felt that God was really close to me as we went through that, and it felt like it turned out that way. Praise to God. There's also an opportunity for me to serve with the 7 fratres that I'm working with in formation here. So the formation team sort of covered the liturgy that night, and I felt so proud, like a daddy-o, like a grandpa, to be serving with these fine young men I get the chance to work with. A couple of days later, Brother Steve Harrow, one of the men in our community, sent me an email thanking me for the liturgy and my work in it anyway, I should say, and saying, you might like this homily too. And I do. It's the homily of Diane Butler Bass. It's called the Holy Thursday Revolution, but she preached it initially on the first Sunday of Easter, so Divine Mercy Sunday in a sense. But she makes an amazing point. She begins the homily by talking about Holy Thursday and what happened there. Jesus, do not let your hearts be troubled. I go ahead to prepare a place for you. Jesus, as I have washed your feet, so you must wash each other's feet, not an option, a mandate, an imperative. Jesus, he broke the bread. This is my body for you. He shared the cup. This is my blood poured out for you. Do this too in remembrance of me. So she talks about the cenacle, the upper room that the apostles prepared at Jesus' instruction for the Passover meal that became for us as Christians the Last Supper. She also acknowledges that in the context of that meal, Jesus declared that someone would betray him. Everybody gets uncomfortable. Peter's nudging to John next to Jesus, lean over, find out who it is. They go one after another, not me, not me, not me, Lord. And eventually, we know how the story unfolds on Thursday night. The beloved disciple, John, the youngest of them, maybe 16, just got his driver's license, maybe. He's the only one who stays with the women at the foot of the cross. Judas has sold him out. Peter will deny him 3 times and weep bitterly. The others will run away to save their tails. The point that Diane Butler Bass makes is that after the resurrection, the disciples don't go to the cross. They don't go back to Calvary. They go back to the upper room. They go back to the upper room. On that first day of the week, despite the fact that the doors were locked where the apostles had gathered for fear of the Jews, despite the locked doors, Jesus comes and is with them. She makes the point that they never were at the cross. Theologically, spiritually, they had their crosses to bear. They would have their crosses to bear in witnessing to Jesus as their lives unfolded from the crucifixion and the resurrection. But they had never been to Calvary except for John. The gathering place they knew was the table. And that's such a great insight. It's something I never thought of before, that it's the table, at the context of food and drink, the context of the Eucharist, and any other food and drink that Jesus makes himself known as risen from the dead. He meets them in the upper room and wishes them peace, forgives them, and commissions them to forgive others. We heard that gospel last week. We've also heard the gospel of where did Cleopas and his buddy, they're walking along toward the Emmaus, 7 miles distant from Jerusalem. Jesus comes up, they don't recognize him. He explains all the scriptures relating to himself. Their hearts are on fire. They get to Emmaus. Jesus, stay with us. The day is over, evening's drawing on, stay with us. And so he went in and lodged with them, and when he sat down at table, he broke the bread, and they recognized him, whereupon he vanished from their sight. And they went out excited witnesses. I mean, think about it. They'd walked 7 miles. They're walking 7 miles back to Jerusalem. That's 14 miles in one day. That's a long walk. To announce the news that in the breaking of the bread they had recognized him. And that's where we take up today in Luke chapter 24. And what do we have in Luke chapter 24? Not only the reference to the Emmaus story, but Jesus comes and makes himself known in the midst of the disciples. They're panicked. They think they're seeing a ghost. So what does he do? Touch me. I'm real. I'm not a spirit. I'm not a ghost. I'm a flesh and blood body back from the dead. And then he asks a question like a high school kid coming home after the long day's work at school. Hey, you guys got anything here to eat? So they gave him a piece of cooked fish, which he ate in their presence. A way to prove that he's a body. Spirits don't need to eat food, can't hold food down, so to speak. It's at the table. We'll see it later on, not to steal other preachers' thunder. They're out fishing. Jesus is on the shore. He's got a fire going. He's got some fish, and alongside the grill, he's got some bread. And they recognize it is the Lord. Do you get it, brothers and sisters? From the table, they return to the table. And at the table, upon return, in the context of simple food and drink, Jesus is recognized and real and present, risen from the dead, alive, mind, heart, body, soul, divinity, humanity, all of it, back from the tomb. I would suggest it suggests two things. First of all, for us in a Roman Catholic tradition, it was November 22nd, 1963, the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated. C.S. Lewis died in London. The Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy was promulgated by the second session of Vatican II, which declares the Sunday Eucharist to be the source and summit of our life as Christians. The breaking of the bread, the sharing of the cup, the breaking open of the word, the gathering around a table, one family around one table, in communion with the risen Lord, in communion like he has been with the Father because of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, in communion with each other over a morsel of bread and a sip of wine. I remember hearing it said back in the 60s and 70s, in a world where so many people go to bed starving, hungry at night, what better form could Jesus have chosen to remain with us than in the form of food and drink? I heard it from Father Maximos from Holy Transfiguration Monastery down in St. Asians, who gave our Norbertine Triduum retreat. Jesus is much more present, he said, in the sacred bread and the sacred cup around the altar, the holy table, in the sacrifice of the Mass and the Passover feast renewed of Calvary, in the sacrament of his body and blood. He's much more present than he could have been in any single body. There he was constricted to a place and a time and a setting. But by way of the food and drink and the table of the Eucharist, he's anywhere and everywhere the bread is broken and the cup is shared in his name. He's present with us when we gather for Holy Communion. He's present within us. And because the same Lord chooses to live in me and know me from the inside out as I am, that lives in you and lives in others, his shared presence brings us together. The table's like a magnet that allows us to encounter the mercy, the power, the hope, the peace, the forgiveness, the reconciliation, the healing of the risen Lord. And I would suggest it goes further than that. Because not every time at Emmaus there's no mention of a cup. On the seashore there's no mention of a cup. In today's gospel passage, it's a piece of cooked fish. There's no mention of bread or cup. But the implication is clear, isn't it, brothers and sisters? That when we reverence the table, which is the altar, when we reverence the table, which is the picnic table in the backyard, or the breakfast bar, or the fancy schmancy dining room table, or the down-to-earth beat-up kitchen table, or the table in the cabin up north where we bring in the burgers and the brats from the Weber grill, boil them in onions and beer, those brats are going to taste good. And we experience that miracle of communion, of fellowship and sisterhood, of spirits together all bellying up to the same board, intimately connected by the table and the food we share. Push it further, if you will. Matthew 25. What's the final exam at Heaven's Gate? I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. Naked and you clothed me, a stranger and you welcomed me, in prison or sick and you came to visit me. Starts out with a table with food and drink. And I'll say 30 years in parish life and 70 years as a Christian, we love it, don't we? Those food drives, when we can bring our canned goods, and I'm not just talking about lima beans and the stuff nobody's going to eat in your cupboard back home. I'm talking about when we can share good, beautiful, bountiful food. The people who work holidays and holy days to feed those who have nowhere else to go. The people who contribute to food banks so that in the off days, people have food enough to keep body and soul together. In all of these ways, the risen Christ is present, brothers and sisters. It's food and drink. It's a table that unites us, that allows us to encounter him, to anticipate the bounty of heaven, like the bounty of the harvest that happens year after year for so many of us. Thanksgiving, Eucharist, third weekend in November. It's also that place where sharing the same bread and the same loaf, we recognize how we are intimately connected with Jesus, with each other. The power of that love that connects different and disparate human beings and cultures in a universal church, in the celebration of the Sunday Eucharist everywhere around the world, basilicas and cathedrals and on tree stumps in the woods and in prison cells and jails and all sorts of other places, on hospital tables and in nursing homes. What other power could be so simple and eloquent? What other power could allow humanity to be connected with God Almighty and with each other than the power that comes from the risen Christ? He is alive at the Father's right hand. He is alive and real. When in his name and at his command we break the bread and share the cup and carry him into the world and reverence him in each other, we become the tabernacles. And when fueled by this Eucharistic feast, we live the gospel to feed the hungry and the thirsty, clothe the naked, and visit the poor, and do justice, so that this world more and more, fueled by the risen Christ at a table, looks more like heaven by God's grace and our persistent efforts. Treasure your tables at home, brothers and sisters. Simple fare or fancy feast. And Sunday after Sunday, every day for those of us who are weak, treasure the Lord's table and the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the cup and the washing of the feet. Happy Easter.